20 Worst Tragedies of Golden Age, Child Stars' Downfalls and Struggles. Behind the glittering facade of Hollywood's golden age lay secrets so dark, so devastating, that the studio system would do anything to keep them hidden. Today, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on 20 young stars whose childhood dreams became living nightmares. What you're about to discover will forever change how you view those classic films you love. But first, let me ask you this. What if I told you that some of Hollywood's most beloved child stars were fighting battles that would break grown adults? What if the very system that made them famous was slowly destroying their lives, one cruel decision at a time? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why so many of these bright young talents never lived to see their 40th birthday, and why their stories serve as a haunting reminder of the price of fame. In the glamorous golden age of Hollywood, child stars were the ultimate commodity. Studios made fortunes off their dimpled smiles and precocious talent. But what happened when the cameras stopped rolling reveals a systematic exploitation that would shock modern audiences. The studio system owned these children, body, soul, and bank account. Parents signed away their kids' childhoods for a shot at stardom, often pocketing most of the earnings. And when these young stars grew up, Hollywood discarded them like yesterday's props. What you're about to discover will change how you see those classic films forever. 20. Bobby Driscoll, Disney's first tragedy. Bobby Driscoll should have been set for life. As Walt Disney's first contracted child star, he wasn't just another pretty face. He was a genuinely gifted actor who brought depth to every role. When he won his Academy Award at 12 for The Window, presenter Donald O'Connor said Bobby had brought more genuine heart to the screen than actors 3 times his age. Disney himself called Bobby his living treasure. But treasures, apparently, were only valuable when they sparkled. The cracks started showing during the filming of Peter Pan. Bobby was 16, his voice changing, his face breaking out in severe acne that makeup couldn't hide. Disney executives who'd once treated him like royalty now avoided eye contact in the hallways. The boy who'd voiced the child who never grew up was committing Hollywood's ultimate sin. He was growing up. Disney terminated his contract with surgical precision. No farewell party, no thank you for the millions you've made us. Just a pink slip and a security escort off the lot. Bobby's parents, who'd grown accustomed to the lifestyle his earnings provided, suddenly faced with a son who couldn't book a commercial, let alone a movie. The rejection devastated Bobby. He tried returning to regular school, but was mercilessly bullied by classmates who taunted him with "Peter Pan's a has-been." He dropped out, fell in with a rough crowd in New York, and discovered that certain substances could numb the pain of being discarded by the only family he'd really known, Hollywood. By 1968, Bobby Driscoll was unrecognizable, living in an abandoned tenement in Greenwich Village, sharing needles with other lost souls. He'd sometimes tell fellow addicts he used to be in movies. They'd laugh, thinking it was just another junkie's delusion. On March 30th, 2 boys playing in the abandoned building found his body. He'd been dead for days. The ultimate heartbreak, his body went unclaimed for over a year, buried in a pauper's grave on Hard Island. His own mother didn't know he'd died until a year and a half later, when she hired a private investigator to find her son. The investigator delivered news that broke her. Bobby had been dead all along, buried under a number, not a name. The boy who'd brought magic to millions died believing he was worthless, forgotten by the very industry that had once promised him the world. 19. Peggy Entwistle, the Hollywood sign's first victim. Peggy Entwistle came to Hollywood with credentials that should have guaranteed success. She'd conquered Broadway, earning rave reviews acting alongside legends like Lorette Taylor. Critics called her the next Bette Davis. At 24, she was beautiful, talented, and had that rare quality casting directors called luminescence. She glowed on camera. But Hollywood in 1932 was a different beast than Broadway. The studios wanted contract players they could mold, not established actresses with their own ideas. RKO signed her for one film, 13 Women, a pre-code thriller about a half-Asian woman seeking revenge on her former sorority sisters. Peggy threw herself into the role, believing this was her big break. Then came the screening. Peggy sat in the dark theater, waiting for her scenes, and waiting and waiting. The film had been butchered in editing, her role reduced to barely a glimpse. Worse, the reviews were savage. One critic wrote, 13 Women should have been called 13 Minutes. That's how long audiences will last before walking out. For Peggy, it was more than a failed film. It was a referendum on her entire life. She'd left Broadway, abandoned a successful stage career, all for this moment. Her uncle later revealed she'd been struggling with devastating personal issues too. 1942. A previous marriage she'd hidden from the studios had ended when she discovered her husband was not only still married to someone else, but had been convicted of assault. The scandal, if revealed, would have ended her career before it began. On September 16, 1932, Peggy told her uncle she was going to the drugstore. Instead, she took a long walk up the winding roads to Mount Lee. The Hollywood sign loomed above Los Angeles like a monument to broken dreams. She climbed the workman's ladder behind the letter H. H for Hollywood, H for hope, H for hell. A maintenance worker found her shoe and purse first, then looked down. The cruelest irony came the next morning. A letter arrived at her uncle's house from the Beverly Hills Playhouse. They wanted to offer Peggy the lead role in their next production, a play about a woman driven to desperate measures by life's disappointments. The role she'd been born to play arrived one day too late. Hollywood would remember her not for her talent, but as a cautionary tale, her ghost said, to haunt the sign that still stands as a monument to both dreams and nightmares. 18. Carl Alfalfa, Switzer, Our Gang's Violent End. If you grew up watching Our Gang or The Little Rascals, you loved Alfalfa, that cowlick that stood straight up, cracking voice that murdered every song, the sweet bumbling pursuit of Darla. Carl Switzer created one of the most endearing characters in film history, but the boy behind the cowlick lived a life that would have horrified his young fans. The problem started early. While other Our Gang kids had parents who saved their earnings, Carl's parents treated him like a cash machine. They spent lavishly, assuming the checks would never stop coming. When Carl aged out of the series at 16, they were shocked to discover they'd saved nothing. Worse, Carl had no education, no skills beyond mugging for the camera, and a face everyone recognized but no one wanted to hire. He tried everything to stay in the business. Bit parts where directors would cruelly make him sing off-key just like old times. Bartending at studios where he'd once been treated like royalty. He even formed a hunting guide service, leading rich Hollywood types on bear hunts, desperately hoping someone would remember him kindly enough to offer him real work. But it was the demons that really destroyed him. Carl had developed a vicious temper, fueled by alcohol and bitterness. He'd get into bar fights, often with fans who mockingly asked him to sing "I'm in the Mood for Love." His friends described him as paranoid, convinced Hollywood had blacklisted him, but there was a conspiracy to keep Alfalfa down. On January 21, 1959, Carl went to collect $50 from Moses Stiltz, money owed for a hunting dog that had gone missing. What happened next depends on who you believe. Stiltz claimed Carl burst in drunk and violent, threatening him with a knife, but witnesses told different stories. Some said Carl was unarmed, that he was actually on his knees begging when Stiltz shot him in the stomach. What's undisputed is that Carl Switzer, aged 31, bled out on Stiltz's floor over $50. The man who'd made millions laugh died in a sordid little drama that wouldn't have made it past the Our Gang writer's room. Coroner ruled it justifiable homicide. No charges were filed. In death, as in life, Hollywood justice failed Alfalfa. His funeral was sparsely attended. A few Our Gang alumni showed up, but most of Hollywood stayed away. They buried him with his cowlick slicked down, finally tamed. The boy who'd sung so badly it was beautiful died believing he wasn't worth even $50. But to millions who grew up with him, Alfalfa was priceless. A reminder that in Hollywood, innocence isn't just lost, it's murdered. 17. Judy Garland, the studio system's most famous casualty. Every time you watch The Wizard of Oz, you're watching a crime in progress. That innocent girl singing about bluebirds and rainbows, she was being systematically destroyed by the very studio that made her a star. MGM's treatment of Judy Garland wasn't just abuse. It was torture disguised as stardom. It started when she was 13. Louis B. Mayer took one look at Frances Gumm and decided she was too fat. Never mind that she was a normal, healthy teenager. The studio put her on a diet that would be considered criminal today. Black coffee, chicken soup, and 80 cigarettes a day to suppress her appetite. When that wasn't enough, they introduced her to diet pills, amphetamines that kept her thin and energetic for those 18-hour shooting days. But here's where it gets truly sinister. Pills kept her awake, so they gave her barbiturates to sleep. Barbiturates made her groggy, so they gave her more amphetamines to wake up. By the time she was Dorothy, Judy was caught in a pharmaceutical prison that would last her entire life. The abuse wasn't just chemical. MGM executives called her fat little pig to her face. They had men follow her to make sure she wasn't eating. They taped her breasts down for Wizard of Oz to make her look younger, while simultaneously sexualizing her in adult roles. When she fell in love with Tyrone Power, the studio forced her to have an to avoid scandal, then pushed her into a marriage with David Rose, as essentially a publicity arrangement. The torture showed on screen if you knew where to look. Those tears in Over the Rainbow, real. The trembling hands in later films, Withdrawal. The weight fluctuations that had gossip columnists clucking. A body at war with itself, pumped full of chemicals and starved of food and love. By her 30s, Judy had attempted to end her life at least 20 times. She'd harm herself in desperate moments, each incident patched up by studio doctors who'd dry her out just enough to work, then start the cycle again. She was their cash cow, and they'd milk her until she was empty. Her final years were a gothic horror story. Married 5 times, broke despite earning millions, performing in dingy clubs to pay tax bills the studio's creative accounting had left her with. She'd show up hours late, if at all, to voice a shadow of its former glory. Audiences came to see the tragedy as much as the talent. Would tonight be the night Judy Garland finally fell apart completely? On June 22, 1969, her 5th husband, Mickey Deans, found her dead in their London bathroom. The coroner ruled it an accidental overdose of barbiturates, the very drugs MGM had first given her 30 years earlier. But those who knew her wondered if it was really accidental. She'd been talking about going to sleep forever, about finally finding her rainbow. At her funeral, thousands lined the streets. Mickey Rooney, her old co-star, sobbed uncontrollably. But where were the studio executives who'd created this tragedy? Nowhere to be found. They'd already moved on to their next victim. Judy Garland died at 47, but MGM had killed her at 13. Every pill, every cruel word, every forced abortion and broken marriage, it all led to that London bathroom. The girl who wanted to go over the rainbow finally escaped, but the cost of that ticket was everything she had, everything she was, everything she might have been. 16. Scotty Beckett, our gang's forgotten tragedy. Scotty Beckett had everything child stars dream of: natural talent, adorable looks, and timing that couldn't be taught. When he joined our gang at age 4, directors marveled at his ability to steal scenes from kids twice his age. He had that rare gift of making scripted lines sound like a real kid talking. Hal Roach himself said Scotty was the most naturally gifted child actor I ever worked with. But natural gifts in Hollywood come with unnatural prices. By age 10, Scotty was earning more than most American families. He'd graduated from Our Gang to Prestige Pictures, acting alongside stars like Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. In King's Row, he played the young Ronald Reagan with such conviction that Reagan himself said, "That kid made me look like an amateur." Directors fought to cast him. Parents bought a mansion in Beverly Hills with his earnings. Then came puberty, Hollywood's grim reaper for child stars. Overnight, Scotty went from cute to awkward. His voice cracked at the wrong moments. His face, once cherubic, turned angular and ordinary. The phone stopped ringing. At 16, he was yesterday's news, watching kids he'd mentored get the roles that should have been his. The rejection broke something in Scotty that never healed. He started drinking at 17, pills at 18. His parents, who'd grown accustomed to the lifestyle his earnings provided, pushed him to try harder, not understanding that Hollywood had already made its decision. Scotty Beckett was done. The arrest started in 1948. Drunk driving, passing bad checks, carrying a concealed weapon. Each mugshot showed a man aging in dog years, the boyish charm replaced by hollow eyes and premature lines. He'd get violent when drunk, especially if someone recognized him. "I used to be Scotty Beckett," he'd scream at bartenders who cut him off. "I was in pictures with Cary Grant." His ex-wife later revealed the depth of his paranoia. He was convinced Hollywood had blacklisted him, that there was a conspiracy to keep him from working. He'd spend days calling agents, studios, anyone who might remember him, begging for work. A few times he got bit parts, show up drunk or not at all, burning the last bridges that might have saved him. On May 8, 1968, a neighbor heard groaning from Scotty's apartment. They found him beaten bloody, semi-conscious on his bathroom floor. His face was so swollen his own father didn't recognize him at the hospital. He lingered for 2 days, occasionally muttering about them coming to get him, before dying at age 38. The official cause of death was listed as a probable beating followed by an overdose. But who beat him? The case was never solved. Some suspected drug dealers, others thought it was a bar fight gone wrong. But those who knew Scotty best believed he'd finally picked a fight with someone who didn't care that he used to be famous. At his funeral, only a handful of people showed up. A few Our Gang alumni, his elderly parents, and a photographer from a tabloid hoping for one last story. They buried him in a modest grave with a simple headstone that didn't even mention his films. The boy who'd made millions laugh was mourned by almost no one. Years later, film historian Leonard Maltin found Scotty's old screen tests in the MGM vault. Watching that bright-eyed 4-year-old charming disarm the camera, knowing how it would end. Maltin said it was like watching a snuff film in slow motion. That's what Hollywood did to its children, filmed their destruction, and called it entertainment. 15. Dorothy Dandridge, Hollywood's first black star's tragic end. Dorothy Dandridge should have changed everything. When she walked on screen in Carmen Jones, she didn't just break the color barrier, she shattered it with a sledgehammer of talent and beauty. She was the first black woman nominated for Best Actress, the first to grace the cover of Life magazine, the first to integrate the whites-only clubs in Vegas. But being first in Hollywood meant being alone, and that loneliness killed her. Born into poverty in Cleveland, Dorothy and her sister Vivian were put to work early by their ambitious mother Ruby. The Dandridge sisters sang for their supper, literally, performing at churches and nightclubs where a good night meant eating, a bad night meant hunger. When they reached Hollywood, Dorothy's beauty set her apart immediately. But in the 1940s Hollywood, beauty in a black woman was a problem to be managed, not a gift to be celebrated. The studios didn't know what to do with her. Too light-skinned for the maid roles that were the only parts available to black actresses. Too dark for leading lady roles opposite white actors. She existed in a Hollywood purgatory, talented enough to star but born the wrong color for a racist system. Then came Carmen Jones, and suddenly Dorothy Dandridge was a star. But stardom for a black woman in 1954 meant something different than it did for her white counterparts. She couldn't stay in the hotels where her films premiered. She couldn't eat in the restaurants where studio executives held meetings. In Vegas, where she performed at packed houses, she had to enter through the kitchen and was forbidden from the casino floor. The greatest torture was her love life. Dorothy fell deeply in love with director Otto Preminger, who directed her in Carmen Jones. But their interracial relationship had to remain secret. They'd meet in hidden apartments, unable to be seen together in public. When she became pregnant with his child, Preminger made it clear, the baby or her career. There could be no scandal. Dorothy chose her career and regretted it for the rest of her life. The abortion broke something in her. Friends said she was never the same after, that a light had gone out. She threw herself into pills and alcohol, trying to numb the pain of living in a world that wanted her talent but not her humanity. Her marriage to Jack Dennison became a nightmare of physical abuse and financial exploitation. He beat her, stole from her, and when she finally divorced him, she discovered he'd emptied her bank accounts. By the 1960s, Dorothy was broke, despite having been one of the highest-paid black performers in America. The roles had dried up. Hollywood had decided one black leading lady per decade was enough. She was performing in dingy nightclubs, her voice ravaged by pills and alcohol, her beauty faded by heartbreak and abuse. On September 8, 1965, Dorothy's manager Earl Mills found her dead in her apartment. She was lying on the bathroom floor, wearing her favorite gold scarf. The coroner ruled it an overdose of tofranil, an antidepressant. She'd taken the equivalent of a month's supply in one night. Was it intentional? Her note suggested otherwise, but those who knew her wondered if she'd simply grown tired of fighting. At her funeral, the Hollywood establishment that had used and discarded her suddenly remembered her worth. The same studios that wouldn't cast her sent elaborate flowers. The same executives who'd told her she was too ethnic for leading roles gave speeches about her groundbreaking career. It was Hollywood hypocrisy at its finest, celebrating in death what they'd denied in life. Dorothy Dandridge died at 42, but she'd been dying since the day Hollywood told her she could be a star, just not a white one. Every barrier she broke cut her. Every ceiling she shattered fell on her head. She paved the way for others with her own body, and Hollywood walked over her without looking back. 14. Brandon DeWild, the boy from Shane. Shane! Come back, Shane. That heartbreaking cry from young Joey Starrett echoed across movie theaters in 1953, delivered with such raw emotion by 11-year-old Brandon DeWild that audiences wept. It became one of cinema's most iconic moments, and it made Brandon a star. But the boy who called for Shane would spend the rest of his short life calling for something he could never find, himself. Brandon wasn't supposed to be in movies at all. His parents were stage actors who looked down on film as inferior. But when George Stevens saw Brandon on Broadway, he knew he'd found his Joey. The boy had something rare, an ability to be completely natural on camera, to make you forget you were watching a performance. Shane transformed Brandon overnight from theater kid to Hollywood sensation. Fan mail arrived by the truckload. He was nominated for an Oscar, the youngest ever at the time. Studios offered contracts worth millions. His parents, seduced by the money, abandoned their theatrical snobbery and signed their son's childhood away. But Brandon never wanted to be a movie star. He wanted to be a serious actor like his parents, to return to the stage where acting was art, not commodity. Instead, he was trapped in Hollywood's machine, forced to play variations of Joey Starrett over and over. Clean-cut American boys, earnest young men, characters as far from his increasingly complex inner life as Shane was from civilization. By his teens, Brandon was drinking heavily, not socially, not recreationally, but with the dedication of someone trying to drown something that wouldn't die. Friends described him as brilliant but tormented, capable of discussing Shakespeare one moment and starting a bar fight the next. He'd drive his cars at insane speeds, as if trying to outrun the ghost of Joey Starrett. His marriage to Susan Ma seemed to calm him briefly. They had a son, Jesse, and Brandon threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to his roles. But the demons always returned. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been stolen at 11, that he was living someone else's dream. The work dried up as he aged. Directors who'd fought to cast young Brandon weren't interested in adult Brandon. He wasn't conventionally handsome, wasn't a leading man type. He was a character actor trapped in a child star's shadow. The rejection ate at him. He'd show up to auditions drunk, sabotaging his own chances, then rage about Hollywood's unfairness. On July 6, 1972, Brandon was driving to Denver in a heavy rainstorm. He was scheduled to perform in a play there. Back to the theater at last, but he never made it. His van struck a parked truck on the highway. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was thrown from the vehicle. He died at 30, the same age as his hero, James Dean. The official report called it an accident, but those who knew Brandon wondered. He'd been drinking. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt despite being a notoriously careful driver when sober. He'd told friends he felt like he was driving towards something, but didn't know what. Maybe it was Shane finally coming back. Maybe it was the childhood that Hollywood stole. Or maybe it was just the end of a road that started when an 11-year-old boy cried out for a gunfighter who could never return. At his funeral, they played the audio from Shane, that young voice full of hope and heartbreak calling out across the valley. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Brandon DeWilde had spent 19 years trying to outrun that voice. In death, it caught up with him at last. 13. Anissa Jones, Family Affairs' tragic Buffy. Every Thursday night, millions of Americans tuned in to watch 6-year-old Anissa Jones charm them as Buffy on Family Affair. With her blonde pigtails, Mrs. Beasley doll, and gap-toothed smile, she was America's little sister. But behind that adorable facade was a child being slowly destroyed by the very adults who were supposed to protect her. Anissa's problems started before Hollywood. Her parents' marriage was a war zone, with young Anissa and her brother Paul caught in the crossfire. When they divorced, her mother Mary saw Anissa's beauty as a meal ticket. She dragged her daughter to audition after audition, living vicariously through each callback and rejection. When Anissa landed Family Affair, Mary thought they'd hit the jackpot, but the show's grueling schedule meant Anissa spent more time on set than at home. 5 days a week, 10 hours a day, she was Buffy. The other 2 days, she was expected to be a normal kid. But how do you play with dolls when you've spent all week pretending to play with them for cameras? The show's producers treated her like a prop rather than a person. They refused to let her grow up on screen, keeping her in little girl dresses and pigtails even as she entered adolescence. When she developed early, they bound her chest. When she wanted to cut her hair, they threatened to sue. She was trapped in Buffy's body while Anissa screamed to get out. Her co-star, Brian Keith, who played Uncle Bill, later admitted he saw the warning signs but didn't know what to do. Anissa would have crying jags between takes. She'd beg to go home. She started refusing to say certain lines, especially the cutesy baby talk that made audiences coo. The producer's solution? Threaten her with replacement. There were thousands of little girls who'd love to be Buffy, they reminded her constantly. When Family Affair ended in 1971, 13-year-old Anissa thought she was finally free. But freedom for a child star often means free fall. She'd earned over $200,000, but her mother had spent most of it. Worse, Anissa discovered she was unemployable. Casting directors saw Buffy, not Anissa. She was too old for child roles, too young for teen roles, and too typecast for anything else. High school was torture. Kids either mocked her for being Buffy or ignored her completely. She started hanging with the stoner crowd, finding that drugs made the pain of being a has-been at 14 bearable. Her mother, desperate to recapture the Family Affair years, pushed her to audition for increasingly degrading roles. When Anissa refused, their relationship exploded. At 16, Anissa petitioned the court for emancipation from her mother. The judge, looking at this broken child, granted it. But freedom at 16 with no skills, no education, and no support system isn't freedom. It's abandonment. Anissa moved in with friends who were happy to party with a former TV star and spend what little money she had left. On August 28, 1976, Anissa went to a party in Oceanside, California. Witnesses said she seemed happy, laughing and dancing. She took what she thought was cocaine, but was actually a massive dose of PCP mixed with other drugs. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. She died at 18, 6 years after Family Affair ended, but really, Buffy had been killing Anissa for years. At her funeral, they buried her with a Mrs. Beasley doll, the prop that had defined and destroyed her life. Her mother wailed about losing her baby, seemingly forgetting she'd lost her daughter years ago when she chose money over motherhood. Brian Keith delivered a eulogy that was more apology than tribute, admitting they'd all failed her. The coroner ruled it accidental overdose, but anyone who knew Anissa's story knew better. Hollywood had murdered another child, this time with kindness and pigtails, and a doll that said, "I love you," when you pulled its string. Anissa Jones died at 18, but Buffy had killed her at 6. 12th. Milos Milos, the stuntman who loved too deep. Milos Milos wasn't technically a child star, but he came to Hollywood young enough to be destroyed by it just the same. Born Milos Milosevic in Yugoslavia, he was Alain Delon's stunt double and bodyguard. Young, handsome, and dangerous in all the ways Hollywood loves until it doesn't. He had the kind of face that made women stop on the street, and the kind of past that made men nervous. Rumors swirled about his life in Europe. Was he really just a stunt double, or had he done darker work for darker people? He never confirmed or denied, just smiled that enigmatic smile that drove Hollywood wild. When he arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1960s, Milos was catnip to the film colony's bored housewives. He taught them to shoot, to ride, to live dangerously. His accent, his mystery, his raw physicality, he was everything their executive husbands weren't. But of all his conquests, the one that would destroy him was Mickey Rooney's wife, Barbara. Barbara Rooney was everything Milos wasn't. Established, married, mother of 4, and completely off limits. But forbidden fruit tastes sweetest in Hollywood, and their affair blazed with the intensity of a film set fire. They met in secret, loved recklessly, and planned a future everyone knew was impossible. Mickey Rooney, Hollywood's eternal boy next door, was not about to be humiliated by some Yugoslav stuntman. He filed for divorce, but that wasn't enough. He used his influence to ensure Milos couldn't work. Suddenly, the stuntman nobody could do without was unemployable. Directors who'd begged for him wouldn't return his calls. His visa was questioned. His past was investigated. Milos watched his world crumble with the fatalism of someone who'd always known Hollywood endings were rarely happy. He'd come from nothing, risen to something, and was returning to nothing. But he had Barbara, or so he thought. On January 30th, 1966, Milos and Barbara were in the bedroom of her Brentwood home. Her children were at school. Mickey was at the studio. They had the house to themselves. One last stolen afternoon. What happened next depends on whether you believe in love or conspiracy. The official story: Milos, depressed over his career and visa problems, shot Barbara and then himself in a tragic pact. The Hollywood story: Mickey Rooney had finally had enough and arranged for his romantic rival to be eliminated, with Barbara as collateral damage. The truth, probably somewhere in between, in that gray area where Hollywood's dreams become nightmares. They were found by Barbara's children coming home from school. Milos was 24, Barbara 29. They died in bed together, which was either romantic or sordid, depending on who was telling the story. Mickey Rooney played the grieving widower perfectly, though some noticed he didn't cancel any work commitments. At Milos's funeral, attended mostly by fellow stunt workers and European expatriates, someone left a single rose with a note: "For the man who lived too intensely for Hollywood." It was unsigned, but everyone knew it was from one of his many conquests, maybe even Barbara from beyond. Milos Milos died young, handsome, and mysterious. Everything Hollywood promises and punishes in equal measure. He'd played with fire in a town made of smoke and mirrors, and in the end, the fire was real while everything else was illusion. 11th, Dana Plato. Different strokes, fallen angel. Dana Plato seemed destined for greatness. As Kimberly Drummond on Different Strokes, she wasn't just Gary Coleman's TV sister, she was positioned to be the show's breakout star. Beautiful, talented, and blessed with that rare quality that made cameras love her, Dana had everything Hollywood claimed to value. But as her story proves, having everything Hollywood wants can be the most dangerous position of all. The warning signs appeared early, hidden beneath that perfect smile and wholesome image. Dana's mother had given her up for adoption as a baby, creating an abandonment wound that never properly healed. Her adoptive parents were loving but naive about the entertainment industry, allowing Hollywood to raise their daughter while they managed her finances and career moves. When Different Strokes became a hit, Dana was living what looked like every teenager's dream. fan magazines featured her on covers, teen heartthrobs asked her to premieres, and her future seemed limitless. But the pressure of maintaining that perfect image while dealing with typical teenage struggles created a pressure cooker that was bound to explode. The explosion came in the form of an unplanned pregnancy at 18. In 1984, an unwed teenage pregnancy was still considered scandalous, especially for someone playing America's sweetheart on television. The show's producers faced a nightmare scenario. Their wholesome family show couldn't survive the scandal of their teenage star becoming an unwed mother. Their solution was swift and brutal. Dana was written off the show without ceremony, her character disappearing between seasons, with barely an explanation to confused fans. One day she was part of television's most beloved family. The next, she was unemployed and unemployable, her reputation in tatters through no fault of her own. The rejection devastated Dana in ways that would echo for the rest of her short life. She'd defined herself by her role on the show, found her identity in being Kimberly Drummond. Without that character, she didn't know who she was anymore. Casting directors saw her pregnancy as evidence of poor judgment, her association with different strokes as limiting baggage. The roles that came were increasingly desperate: low-budget horror films, direct-to-video thrillers, anything that would pay the bills for a single mother with dwindling options. But the real killer was the pain medication. It started legitimately, prescription drugs for legitimate issues, but quickly became the only thing that could numb the agony of professional rejection and personal humiliation. What began as occasional use to get through difficult days became daily necessity just to function. She'd show up to auditions under the influence, miss appointments entirely, and burn bridges with the few directors still willing to take chances on former child stars. Her marriage to Lenny Lambert provided temporary stability and gave her a son she adored, but even motherhood couldn't save her from the demons that grew stronger each day. When Lambert filed for divorce and fought for custody of their son Tyler, Dana's world collapsed completely. The court battles consumed what little money she had left, and the stress drove her deeper into the pharmaceutical prison that was slowly killing her. By the 1990s, Dana was living a nightmare that would have horrified the fans who remembered her as Sweet Kimberly. She was arrested for robbing a video store at gunpoint, not for thrills, but for money to buy drugs. The mugshot showed a woman aged far beyond her 28 years, hollow-eyed and desperate, barely recognizable as the fresh-faced teenager who'd charmed America. She served time, got clean, relapsed, got clean again. Each cycle took more from her, leaving less of the woman who might have been. The media covered her downfall with the same enthusiasm they'd once covered her success, turning her pain into entertainment for a public that loved watching stars fall as much as they loved seeing them rise. The final chapter came on May 8th, 1999. Dana was found dead in her motorhome in Oklahoma, where she'd been living with her fiancé, Robert Menchaca. The official cause was a prescription drug overdose, the same legal pharmaceuticals that had started her down this dark path years earlier. She was 34 years old, but looked 50, her face bearing the accumulated damage of a life lived too hard, too fast, with too little support. Her son Tyler was 14 when she died, the same age Dana had been when different strokes made her famous. At her funeral, Gary Coleman delivered a eulogy that broke hearts across America. "She was my TV sister, but more than that, she was my friend," he said through tears. "Hollywood chewed her up and spit her out, and we all just watched it happen." The tragedy of Dana Plato isn't just that she died young, it's that she died believing she was worthless. The industry that had made millions from her talent couldn't spare the compassion to help her when she needed it most. They used her youth, her beauty, her vulnerability, and when those assets were depleted, they discarded her like a broken prop. Dana Plato's story is a reminder that behind every child star's smile is a real person with real pain, and that fame without support is just another form of abandonment. She died calling out for the same thing little Joey Starrett called for in Shane: someone to come back, someone to care, someone to save her from a world that had already moved on to the next pretty face. 10. Trent Lehman, Nanny and the Professor's Silent Goodbye. Trent Lehman was the middle child on Nanny and the Professor, the sweet-faced boy who made audiences believe in magic every Friday night from 1970 to 1971. As Butch Everett, he brought an authentic boyishness to television that couldn't be manufactured or coached. His gap-toothed grin and earnest delivery made him instantly lovable. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Trent faced a reality that no amount of television magic could fix. The show's cancellation hit Trent harder than anyone expected. At 11 years old, He'd grown accustomed to the structure, attention, and purpose that came with being a working actor. Suddenly, those long days on set, which had felt like work to adults, were revealed to have been the happiest times of his young life. Without the show, Trent felt lost in ways he couldn't articulate to the adults around him. His parents, like so many families of child stars, had organized their entire lives around their son's career. When the checks stopped coming, the family faced not just financial pressure, but an identity crisis. Who were they if Trent wasn't a star? The transition back to normal life proved impossible for a family that had forgotten what normal looked like. Trent tried to continue acting, but the cruel mathematics of child stardom worked against him. He was too old for the cute kid roles that had made him famous, too young for teenage parts, and too identified with Butch Everett to be taken seriously for anything else. Casting directors would take one look at him and say, "Oh, you're the kid from that magic show," then move on to the next hopeful. The rejection was crushing for a boy who'd grown up believing his worth was tied to his ability to entertain others. School became torture as classmates alternated between mocking him for being a has-been and expecting him to be the same cheerful character they'd seen on television. Trent began to withdraw, spending hours alone in his room, replaying old episodes and wondering where his life had gone wrong. His teenage years were marked by increasingly erratic behavior. Friends described him as brilliant but troubled, capable of incredible insights one moment and incomprehensible rage the next. He began experimenting with substances that promised to numb the pain of being forgotten, but they only amplified his existing mental health struggles. The family moved frequently, chasing fresh starts that never materialized. Each new town represented hope that Trent could reinvent himself, but his face was too recognizable, his story too tragic. Everywhere they went, he was either that kid from TV or a cautionary tale about child stars gone wrong. There was no middle ground, no space for him to just be a normal teenager trying to figure out life. By his early 20s, Trent was struggling with severe depression and addiction issues that his family felt helpless to address. The mental health resources available in the 1970s and early 80s were primitive compared to today's standards, and the stigma surrounding both addiction and mental illness meant that families often suffered in silence rather than seeking help. On January 14, 1982, 20-year-old Trent Lehman was found dead, having taken his own life on the grounds of his old elementary school. The location wasn't random. It was one of the last places he remembered being truly happy before Hollywood entered his life and changed everything. He'd returned to the scene of his lost childhood, perhaps hoping to find some peace there. The note he left behind was heartbreaking in its simplicity. He wrote about feeling like he'd peaked at age 11, that everything after Nanny and the Professor had been downhill. He'd spent a decade trying to recapture the magic of those television days, but real life couldn't compete with the carefully scripted world where problems were solved in 30 minutes, and everyone loved the cute kid with the gap-toothed smile. His funeral was attended by his Nanny and the Professor co-stars, who spoke about a boy they remembered as joyful and full of life. Juliet Mills, who played the magical Nanny, wept as she described Trent's infectious laugh and natural sweetness, but they also admitted they'd lost touch with him after the show ended, caught up in their own careers and lives. Hollywood's most tragic truth: the families created for television rarely survive the cancellation. Trent Lehman's death at 20 represents one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the child star tragedy playbook. He wasn't destroyed by drugs or abuse or exploitation in the traditional sense. Instead, he was killed by the simple, devastating reality that the best part of his life had happened before he was old enough to drive. Everything that came after felt like an anticlimax to a story that had ended when he was still a child. The magic that made Nanny and the Professor work came from Trent's genuine innocence and joy. But innocence, once lost, can never be reclaimed, and joy becomes impossible when you're convinced your life's purpose ended in elementary school. Trent Lehman died calling out for the same thing his character had once found: a little magic to make everything better. But in real life, magic doesn't exist, and some wounds are too deep for television endings to heal. 9. River Phoenix, the beautiful boy who burned too bright. River Phoenix was supposed to be different. When he emerged in the 1980s as a fresh-faced teenager with extraordinary talent, he represented hope that Hollywood could nurture young artists without destroying them. He was intelligent, environmentally conscious, and seemingly grounded despite his otherworldly beauty and gift for acting. But River's story became another cautionary tale about what happens when sensitivity meets an industry built on exploitation and excess. Born into a family that joined the controversial religious group Children of God, River's childhood was unconventional long before Hollywood entered the picture. His parents, Arlen and John, eventually left the group and changed the family name from Bottom to Phoenix, symbolically rising from the ashes of their past. They moved to Los Angeles when River was in his early teens, determined to help their talented son become an actor. River's breakthrough came with Stand By Me in 1986, where his portrayal of Chris Chambers revealed an actor of remarkable depth and naturalism. Unlike many young performers who seemed to be playing dress-up, River inhabited his characters completely. Directors marveled at his instinctive understanding of human nature, his ability to find truth in every scene. He wasn't just beautiful, he was genuinely gifted in ways that suggested a major career ahead. But River's sensitivity, which made him such a compelling actor, also made him vulnerable to Hollywood's darker temptations. He felt everything deeply. The pain of his characters, the pressure of fame, the weight of expectations from family and industry alike. His parents had sacrificed everything to support his career, moving the entire family to Los Angeles based on his potential. The responsibility of being the family's primary breadwinner from his teenage years created enormous pressure. As River's star rose with films like Running on Empty and My Own Private Idaho, he struggled with the disconnect between his public image and private reality. Magazines portrayed him as the perfect teenage heartthrob, clean living, environmentally conscious, morally upright. But behind the scenes, River was experimenting with substances that promised to quiet the noise in his head, to ease the anxiety that came with constant scrutiny. His relationship with drugs was complicated by his genuine desire to expand his consciousness and creativity. River wasn't interested in numbing himself. He wanted to feel more, experience more, understand the human condition more deeply. But the line between exploration and dependency is thin, and River crossed it without realizing the danger until it was too late. The pressure intensified with each role. River felt responsible not just for his own career, but for his younger siblings, especially Joaquin, who was also pursuing acting. He'd made his family financially secure, but at the cost of his own emotional well-being. Friends described him as carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, desperate to live up to everyone's expectations while struggling with private demons he couldn't share. His performances became increasingly intense and personal. In My Own Private Idaho, his portrayal of a narcoleptic male prostitute searching for his mother was so raw and vulnerable that it seemed to strip away all pretense. Critics praised his fearlessness as an actor, not realizing they were watching someone who'd forgotten how to protect himself emotionally. On October 30th, 1993, River attended the opening of a new club owned by his friend Johnny Depp. The Viper Room was supposed to be a safe space for actors and musicians to hang out away from the tabloid spotlight. But that night, River took a combination of substances that his system couldn't handle. Outside the club, on the sidewalk of Sunset Boulevard, he collapsed while his younger brother Joaquin frantically called for help. The 911 call was heartbreaking. Joaquin's voice cracking as he begged paramedics to hurry, River convulsing on the ground while friends tried desperately to save him. He was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead at 1:51 a.m. He was 23 years old, with at least 5 decades of brilliant performances ahead of him. River's death sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Here was a young man who'd seemed to have everything: talent, beauty, success, principles, yet he'd been destroyed by the same forces that claimed so many others. His funeral became a gathering of his generation's most promising young actors, all wondering if they were looking at their own potential future. The tragedy of River Phoenix isn't just that he died young, it's that he died believing he wasn't good enough. Despite critical acclaim and commercial success, despite the respect of his peers and the adoration of fans worldwide, River carried a sense of inadequacy that no amount of external validation could cure. He'd been perfect for everyone except himself. His mother Arlen spoke at his funeral about a boy who'd cried watching nature documentaries, who'd refused to wear leather or eat meat from an early age, who'd felt the pain of the world so acutely that it sometimes overwhelmed him. River felt everything, she said through tears. Maybe he felt too much for this world. River Phoenix's death marked the end of an era of innocence in Hollywood. The beautiful boy who'd seemed different, who'd promised to change the industry from within, had instead been changed by it. His legacy lives on in his films and in his brother Joaquin's career, but the loss of what might have been continues to haunt those who knew him. 8. Heather O'Rourke, Poltergeist's Stolen Angel. Heather O'Rourke's story reads like a horror movie, but the real terror wasn't the supernatural forces she faced on screen. It was the very human monsters who surrounded her during her brief, tragic life. As little Carol Ann in the Poltergeist trilogy, Heather became the face of childhood innocence under supernatural threat. But the most dangerous predators weren't ghosts or demons. They were the adults entrusted with her care. Discovered at age 5 while having lunch with her mother at MGM's commissary, Heather possessed that rare quality casting directors call luminescence, an inner light that cameras couldn't resist. Steven Spielberg himself spotted her and knew immediately she was his Carol Ann. Her audition was essentially just being herself, a precocious little girl with blonde curls and enormous blue eyes who could deliver the iconic line, "They're here," with perfect mixture of fear and wonder. The first Poltergeist film made Heather an instant star, but it also put her in the crosshairs of Hollywood's most dangerous predators. The film industry in the early 1980s was still largely unregulated when it came to protecting child actors, and set tutors and chaperones were often more concerned with keeping productions on schedule than safeguarding young performers. Between films, Heather's life seemed charmed from the outside. She appeared on talk shows, did magazine photo shoots, and became one of the most recognizable child actors in America. But those who worked closely with her began noticing changes. The bubbly little girl who'd charmed Spielberg was becoming increasingly withdrawn and anxious. She'd have panic attacks before certain scenes, particularly those involving older male actors or crew members. Years later, when Hollywood's culture of abuse finally began to be exposed, industry insiders would reveal the horrific truth about what happened to Heather during her years as a child star. Multiple sources confirmed that she was systematically abused by powerful men in the industry who used their positions to exploit her vulnerability. The details are too disturbing to recount in full, but they paint a picture of a little girl whose innocence was stolen by the very people who profited from her talent. Her mother, Kathleen, later admitted she'd been naive about the dangers her daughter faced. Like many stage parents, she was dazzled by the attention and money that came with Heather's success. She trusted the wrong people, believed the wrong promises, and failed to protect her daughter when it mattered most. The guilt would haunt her for the rest of her life. By the time production began on Poltergeist 3, Heather was showing signs of severe physical and emotional distress. She'd grown thin and pale, her famous smile appearing forced in publicity photos. She complained frequently of stomach pains and had difficulty eating. Medical professionals who examined her noted symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma, but their concerns were dismissed by studio executives eager to complete the film. On January 31, 1988, Heather was at home with flu-like symptoms when she suddenly became critically ill. Her stepfather rushed her to the hospital, where doctors discovered she was suffering from a rare condition that had gone undiagnosed for months. Her intestinal tract was severely damaged, leading to toxic shock and cardiac arrest. She died during emergency surgery at age 12. The official cause of death was listed as acute bowel obstruction, complicated by septic shock. But many who knew Heather's story believed her physical breakdown was directly related to the psychological trauma she'd endured. The stress of prolonged abuse can manifest in severe physical symptoms, and Heather's body had essentially shut down under the weight of what she'd been forced to endure. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of fans and industry professionals, many of whom claimed to be shocked by her sudden death. Steven Spielberg delivered a eulogy praising her talent and sweet nature, but notably avoided any mention of her final years or the circumstances that might have contributed to her decline. The official narrative was that of a talented child taken too soon by a rare medical condition. A tragedy, but not a crime. But the truth about Heather O'Rourke was far darker than Hollywood wanted to admit. She'd been systematically destroyed by adults who saw her not as a child to be protected, but as a commodity to be exploited. Her death was the inevitable result of a system that prioritized profit over human decency, that turned innocent children into products for adult consumption. The Poltergeist curse, the supposed supernatural force that claimed the lives of several cast members, became Hollywood legend. But there was nothing supernatural about what happened to Heather O'Rourke. She was murdered by human monsters who hid behind suits and smiles, who used their power to destroy innocence, and then covered their tracks with money and influence. Years later, when the Me Too movement finally gave victims a voice, several actresses came forward with stories about the same powerful men who'd abused Heather. But justice for her would never come. Too much time had passed, too many witnesses had been silenced, too much evidence had been buried, along with the little girl who'd once been America's sweetheart. Heather O'Rourke died believing she was alone, that no one would believe her if she told the truth about what had been done to her. She was wrong. People knew. They just chose to look the other way. Her story stands as one of Hollywood's most shameful chapters, a reminder that the real monsters don't live in the movies, they make them. 7. Dominique Dunne, A Dynasty Cut Short. Dominique Dunne seemed destined for greatness. As the youngest daughter of celebrated writer Dominique Dunne, she'd grown up in Hollywood royalty, surrounded by talent and opportunity. Her breakout role as Dana Freeling in Poltergeist showcased not just her natural beauty, but a depth of talent that promised a long, successful career. But Dominique's story became a different kind of horror, one where the monster wasn't supernatural, but devastatingly human. Born into privilege, Dominique could have coasted on her family name, but she was determined to earn her success. She studied at Colorado State University before returning to Los Angeles to pursue acting seriously. Her approach was methodical and professional. She took classes, worked with coaches, and slowly built a resume of small but impressive roles. When Spielberg cast her in Poltergeist, it felt like validation of her hard work and talent. The film's success opened doors for Dominique that money couldn't buy. She landed a starring role in the television series Hill Street Blues and was in talks for several major film projects. At 22, she had everything ahead of her: youth, beauty, talent, connections, and most importantly, the work ethic to make the most of her opportunities. But success in Hollywood often comes with dangerous complications, and for Dominique, that complication had a name: John Thomas Sweeney. A chef at the trendy Los Angeles restaurant Ma Maison, Sweeney seemed charming and sophisticated when they first met. He moved in elite circles, cooking for celebrities and industry power players. To a young actress trying to establish herself, he appeared to be the perfect partner, someone who understood her world but wasn't competing with her for attention. The relationship deteriorated quickly once they moved in together. Sweeney revealed himself to be possessively jealous and increasingly violent. He couldn't handle Dominique's success, her independence, or the attention she received from other men. Friends later recalled seeing bruises on her arms and face that she'd explain away as clumsiness or accidents. The confident young woman they'd known began to seem nervous and withdrawn. Dominique tried to end the relationship multiple times, but Sweeney wouldn't let go. He'd appear at her work, follow her to auditions, and threaten anyone who tried to help her. In the era before stalking laws and restraining orders provided meaningful protection, women like Dominique were largely on their own when dealing with obsessive ex-partners. The final confrontation came on October 30th, 1982. Dominique was at her West Hollywood home rehearsing lines with actor David Packer when Sweeney arrived demanding to speak with her. What happened next was witnessed by Packer, who heard the argument escalate into violence. Sweeney attacked Dominique in her own driveway, her into unconsciousness, while Packer called police from inside the house. Paramedics arrived to find Dominique brain dead from lack of oxygen. She lingered on life support for 5 days, while her family maintained a vigil, hoping for a miracle that never came. On November 4th, 1982, she was pronounced dead at age 22. The promising young actress who'd brought the Freeling family to life in Poltergeist was gone, murdered by a man who claimed to love her. The trial that followed exposed the ugly reality of how the justice system treated domestic violence in the 1980s. Sweeney's defense portrayed him as a victim of his own emotions, a man driven to temporary insanity by love and jealousy. They painted Dominique as a party girl who'd provoked her own murder through her lifestyle and career choices. The prosecution struggled to convict a man who looked respectable and expressed remorse for his actions. In a verdict that shocked the entertainment industry and Dominique's family, Sweeney was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to just 6.5 years in prison. He served less than 4 years before being released to rebuild his life, while Dominique remained dead at 22. The message was clear. In 1980s America, a woman's life was worth less than a man's temporary loss of control. Dominique's father, Dominique Dunne, channeled his grief and rage into a crusade for victims' rights that lasted the rest of his life. He attended every day of Sweeney's trial, writing about the experience for Vanity Fair in articles that helped expose the inadequacy of domestic violence laws. His coverage of the case launched a second career as a true crime writer, but no amount of success could bring back his daughter. The funeral was attended by Hollywood luminaries who spoke about a young woman taken far too soon. Spielberg recalled her professionalism and natural talent. Her Poltergeist co-stars remembered her warmth and humor, but underneath the public tributes was a darker recognition. This could have happened to any of them. Domestic violence didn't respect fame or fortune or family connections. Dominique Dunne's murder became a watershed moment for domestic violence awareness in Hollywood. Her death helped inspire stronger stalking laws and better protection for victims of intimate partner violence. But those changes came too late for her, another young woman whose potential was snuffed out by a man who couldn't accept rejection. She died believing she could handle Sweeney on her own, that her success and independence would protect her from his violence. She was wrong, but she shouldn't have had to be right. In a just world, a woman should be able to end a relationship without fearing for her life. Dominique Dunne's story reminds us that we still don't live in that world. 6. Jonathan Brandis, seaQuest's lost boy. Jonathan Brandis had the kind of face that launched 1,000 teenage crushes and the kind of talent that promised decades of great performances. As Lucas Wolinchak on seaQuest DSV, he wasn't just another teen heartthrob, he was a serious young actor who brought intelligence and depth to every role. But Jonathan's story became a tragedy about what happens when early success creates expectations that become impossible to meet. Born in Connecticut, Jonathan started acting as a child, appearing in commercials and small television roles. Unlike many child stars who were pushed into the business by ambitious parents, Jonathan genuinely loved performing. He studied his craft seriously, working with coaches and developing the technical skills that would set him apart from his peers. By his early teens, he was booking significant roles and building a reputation as one of the most promising young actors in Hollywood. His breakthrough came with The Never-Ending Story 2, where his performance as Bastian showed his ability to carry a major film while still maintaining the authenticity that made him so appealing. The success led directly to seaQuest DSV, the underwater adventure series that would make him a household name and teen idol. For 3 seasons, Jonathan was one of the most recognizable faces on television. But success as a teenager in Hollywood can be a double-edged sword. While Jonathan's career was flourishing, he was struggling with the pressure of being a role model for millions of young fans. He felt responsible for maintaining a perfect public image while dealing with the normal confusion and insecurities of adolescence. The weight of that responsibility began to affect his mental health in ways that weren't immediately apparent to those around him. When seaQuest ended in 1996, Jonathan faced the challenge that destroys many child stars, the transition to adult roles. At 20, he was too old for the teen heartthrob parts that had made him famous, but too young and inexperienced for serious adult roles. Casting directors saw him as Lucas Wolinchak, not as Jonathan Brandis the actor. The phone stopped ringing with the same frequency, and the roles that came were increasingly disappointing. Jonathan's response was to work harder, to try to prove his versatility as an actor. He took on independent films, television guest spots, anything that would show his range and remind people of his talent. But the entertainment industry has a short memory, and audiences had already moved on to the next generation of young stars. Each rejection felt like a personal failure, each lost role a sign that his best days were behind him. The pressure intensified when Jonathan tried to transition from acting to directing. He'd always been interested in the technical side of filmmaking, and directing seemed like a natural evolution of his career. But the projects he developed struggled to find financing, and the few that were made received limited distribution. For someone who'd been used to success from an early age, the constant struggle and rejection were devastating. Friends described Jonathan as increasingly isolated in his final years. He'd always been introspective, but that quality began to turn into something darker. He became hypercritical of his own work, obsessing over perceived failures and missed opportunities. The confident young man who'd charmed millions of viewers was replaced by someone who seemed to question his own worth with every setback. The entertainment industry's emphasis on youth became particularly cruel for Jonathan. While female stars face ageism throughout their careers, male actors typically have more longevity. But Jonathan's particular brand of boyish charm had an expiration date, and he knew it. Watching younger actors get the roles he might have played became a daily reminder of his diminishing relevance in Hollywood. On November 12, 2003, Jonathan was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment. He had taken his own life at age 27, leaving behind no no note but plenty of unanswered questions. Friends and family were shocked. They'd known he was struggling professionally, but hadn't realized the depth of his despair. The young man who'd seemed to have everything had been fighting a battle that no one fully understood. His death sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry and devastated the fans who'd grown up watching him. At his funeral, former co-stars and friends spoke about a talented, sensitive young man who'd been crushed by the weight of expectations, both his own and others. They remembered his kindness, his professionalism, and his genuine love for the craft of acting. The tragedy of Jonathan Brandis is that he died still believing he'd failed, when in reality he'd achieved more in his brief career than most actors accomplish in a lifetime. He'd entertained millions, created memorable characters, and earned the respect of his peers. But in Hollywood, yesterday's success means nothing if today brings rejection. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of early fame and the importance of mental health support for young performers. But those lessons came too late for Jonathan, who died thinking his career was over when he was still young enough to reinvent himself completely. The boy who'd explored underwater worlds on SeaQuest drowned in his own despair, alone in an apartment filled with the remnants of a career that others would have envied. 5. Brad Renfro, the client's final case. Brad Renfro possessed the kind of raw, natural talent that casting directors dream of finding. Discovered at age 10 playing in his Tennessee hometown, Brad had never acted professionally when he was cast as the lead in The Client, opposite Susan Sarandon and Tommy Lee Jones. His performance was so authentic, so lived in, that it seemed impossible he was acting at all. But Brad's natural ability came from a dark place. He understood troubled characters because he was living a troubled life. Growing up in a broken home in Knoxville, Brad was raised primarily by his grandmother, while his mother struggled with her own demons. When talent scouts discovered him playing with friends, they saw a boy with the perfect combination of vulnerability and toughness that Hollywood loves in its young male stars. What they didn't see was a child who'd already experienced more trauma than most adults, whose authentic performances came from real pain rather than acting technique. The Client made Brad an overnight sensation, but success at 10 years old is a different kind of burden than adult fame. Brad was suddenly the family's primary breadwinner, responsible for supporting not just himself, but multiple relatives who'd become dependent on his earnings. The pressure of being a child provider, while dealing with the normal challenges of growing up, proved overwhelming. Unlike other child stars who were sheltered by protective parents, Brad was largely on his own in Hollywood. His grandmother was loving but unprepared for the entertainment industry's demands and dangers. His mother was battling her own addiction issues and couldn't provide the guidance and protection he needed. Brad was essentially raising himself while trying to maintain a career that required constant professionalism and maturity. The roles that followed The Client showed Brad's range, but also revealed his attraction to darker material. In Tom and Huck, Apt Pupil, and Bully, he played characters dealing with violence, corruption, and moral ambiguity. Directors praised his ability to find truth in difficult scenes, not realizing they were watching a young man process his own trauma through his characters. But Brad's personal struggles were escalating alongside his professional success. He began experimenting with substances in his early teens, initially as a way to cope with the pressures of fame and family responsibility. What started as occasional use quickly became a pattern of self-medication that would define the rest of his short life. His arrests began in his late teens: drunk driving, drug possession, public intoxication. Each incident made headlines, turning Brad's private struggles into public entertainment. The tabloid coverage was particularly cruel, portraying him as just another spoiled child star rather than a young man battling serious addiction and mental health issues with minimal support. The film roles began to dry up as Brad's reputation for unreliability spread through Hollywood. Directors who'd once fought to cast him became reluctant to take chances on someone whose personal problems might derail their productions. Each lost opportunity fed his sense of failure and drove him deeper into the cycle of addiction that was consuming his life. Brad tried to get clean multiple times, entering rehab facilities and making sincere efforts to turn his life around. But addiction is particularly cruel to young people whose brains are still developing, and Brad's early trauma made recovery even more challenging. Each relapse felt like a personal failure rather than a symptom of a disease that required ongoing treatment and support. His final years were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to salvage his career and his life. He took smaller roles in independent films, hoping to prove he could still deliver the performances that had made him famous, but the combination of addiction and depression had taken its toll on his appearance and abilities. The boy who'd once been hailed as the next River Phoenix was barely recognizable as the young man who'd charmed audiences in The Client. On January 15, 2008, Brad was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment by friends who'd come to check on him. He was 25 25 years old, dead from an accidental overdose of heroin. The official cause was acute heroin and morphine intoxication, a clinical description that couldn't capture the tragedy of a life cut short by circumstances beyond a child's ability to control. His funeral in Tennessee was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched during his brief time on Earth. His grandmother, who'd raised him and watched helplessly as addiction consumed him, spoke about a boy who'd never had a real chance at a normal childhood. His client co-stars remembered a talented, sweet kid who'd been fighting battles that no 10-year-old should have to face. The tragedy of Brad Renfro is that his greatest strength as an actor, his ability to access authentic emotion and pain, came from experiences that no child should have to endure. He was celebrated for bringing truth to his performances, but that truth was born from trauma that would ultimately destroy him. Hollywood used his pain to create compelling entertainment, but offered little support when that same pain threatened to consume him. Brad died believing he was a failure, when in reality, he was a victim of a system that exploits young talent without providing adequate protection or support. His story stands as a reminder that behind every great child performance is a real child dealing with real problems, and that our responsibility to protect these young people extends far beyond their box office value. 4. Corey Haim, the lost boy who never found his way home. Corey Haim was the epitome of 1980s teen stardom, beautiful, talented, and blessed with a smile that could light up any movie screen. As one half of The Two Coreys, alongside Corey Feldman, he defined what it meant to be a young heartthrob for an entire generation. But behind that perfect smile was a young man being systematically destroyed by the very industry that made him famous. Born in Toronto, Corey started acting as a child in Canadian productions before making his American debut in Firstborn at age 12. His breakout role came with Lucas, where his portrayal of a lovesick teenager showed both his natural charisma and his ability to find emotional truth in every scene. When the Lost Boys made him a full-fledged teen idol, it seemed like Corey Haim could do no wrong. But success in Hollywood, especially for young male actors, came with dangers that Corey was unprepared to face. In interviews years later, both Corey and his friend Feldman would reveal the horrific truth about what happened to young actors in 1980s Hollywood, a systematic culture of abuse perpetrated by powerful men who used their positions to exploit vulnerable teenagers. Corey later identified the moment his life changed forever. During a film production when he was 14 years old, he was assaulted by a man he'd trusted, someone who'd presented himself as a mentor and father figure. The trauma of that assault and his inability to process or report it began a downward spiral that would consume the rest of his life. Like many abuse victims, Corey turned to substances to numb the pain and confusion he couldn't otherwise handle. What started as experimentation quickly became dependency, as he discovered that certain drugs could temporarily quiet the voices in his head that told him he was damaged, worthless, complicit in his own victimization. The signs of his distress were visible to anyone who cared to look. His weight fluctuated dramatically as he struggled with eating disorders. His behavior became increasingly erratic on set. He had difficulty maintaining relationships with co-stars and crew members. But in an industry where eccentricity is often dismissed as artistic temperament, Corey's cries for help were largely ignored. The Two Coreys phenomenon masked the depth of his struggles for a while. The friendship with Feldman provided some stability, and their joint appearances made it seem like Corey was thriving, but privately, he was falling apart. The demands of maintaining a public persona while dealing with private trauma proved impossible to sustain. As Corey aged out of teen roles, his career began to falter. Unlike female teen stars who often transition to adult romantic comedies, young male actors face a more difficult path to sustained success. Corey's particular brand of vulnerable masculinity had an expiration date, and he knew it. Each rejected audition felt like confirmation that his best days were behind him, that he was becoming a cautionary tale rather than a success story. By the 1990s, Corey was trapped in a cycle of addiction and depression that seemed impossible to break. He'd get clean for months at a time, appearing on talk shows to discuss his recovery and attempt comebacks with direct-to-video films. But the underlying trauma that had started his problems was never properly addressed, and each relapse took him further from the bright-eyed teenager who charmed millions. His later years were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to reclaim his former glory. Reality shows, celebrity boxing matches, anything that would put him back in the spotlight and provide income to support his expensive habits. The media coverage was often cruel, focusing on his physical deterioration rather than the mental health crisis that was slowly killing him. On March 10, 2010, Corey was found dead in his mother's apartment at age 38. The official official cause was pneumonia, but those who knew his story understood that his death was the inevitable result of decades of untreated trauma and addiction. His body had simply given up after years of abuse and neglect. At his funeral, Corey Feldman delivered a eulogy that revealed the depth of their friendship and the tragedy of his loss. He spoke about a boy who'd been robbed of his innocence by predators who used their power to destroy young lives. The entertainment industry that had profited from Corey's talent largely ignored his death, already focused on the next generation of young stars. The tragedy of Corey Haim is that he died still believing he was worthless, when in reality he was a victim who deserved compassion and proper treatment. His story became a catalyst for discussions about abuse in Hollywood, but those conversations came too late to save him. The lost boy from the Lost Boys never found his way home. 3. Judith Barsi, The Land Before Time's broken voice. Judith Barsi had a voice that could make angels weep. As the voice of Ducky in The Land Before Time and Anne Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven, she brought joy to millions of children who had no idea they were listening to a little girl living in terror. At 10 years old, Judith possessed a rare combination of vocal talent and emotional intelligence that made her one of the most sought-after child voice actors in Hollywood. But behind the microphone was a child being systematically abused by the man who should have protected her most. Born to Hungarian immigrants, Judith started acting at age 5 when her natural charisma and photogenic appearance caught the attention of talent scouts. Her early success in commercials and small television roles seemed like the American dream realized, a hard-working immigrant family finding prosperity through their daughter's talents. But success brought attention that would ultimately prove deadly. Judith's father, Josef Barsi, was a man consumed by jealousy and rage. As his daughter's career flourished and she became the family's primary breadwinner, his resentment grew into something much darker. He began physically and emotionally abusing both Judith and her mother, Maria, creating a household ruled by fear and violence. The beautiful little girl who charmed audiences on screen lived in constant terror at home. The signs of abuse were visible to anyone who looked carefully. Judith would arrive at auditions with unexplained bruises that she'd explain away with stories about clumsiness. She became increasingly anxious and withdrawn, a stark contrast to the bubbly personality that had made her so appealing to casting directors. Child welfare workers were called to investigate the home multiple times, but Josef was skilled at presenting a normal facade when outsiders were present. Her mother Maria was trapped in her own nightmare, an immigrant woman with limited English and fewer resources, terrified of her husband but unable to protect her daughter or herself. Josef had threatened to kill them both if they ever tried to leave, and Maria believed him. The cycle of abuse continued while Judith's career reached new heights with major voice acting roles that should have been the foundation for a lifetime of success. The contrast between Judith's professional and personal life was heartbreaking. In recording studios, she was a consummate professional who could nail difficult dialogue in single takes. Directors marveled at her ability to convey complex emotions through voice alone. But between takes, she'd sometimes break down crying for reasons she couldn't or wouldn't explain to the adults around her. As Judith's success grew, so did Josef's paranoia and violence. He became convinced that Hollywood executives were trying to steal his daughter from him, that his wife was plotting to leave him, that everyone was conspiring against him. The truth was simpler and more tragic. His own behavior was destroying the family he claimed to love. On July 25, 1988, Josef's threats finally became reality. In their Canoga Park home, he shot both Judith and Maria before setting the house on fire and taking his own life. Judith was found in her bedroom, still clutching a Jetsons videotape. She was 10 years old, at the height of her career, with The Land Before Time scheduled for release just months later. The entertainment industry was shocked by the murders, but many who'd worked with Judith admitted they'd suspected something was terribly wrong at home. The warning signs had been there, the unexplained injuries, the anxiety, the sudden personality changes, but no one had acted decisively enough to save her. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of voice actors, directors, and others whose lives she'd touched during her brief career. They buried a little girl who'd brought happiness to millions while experiencing none herself. The voice that had made Ducky such a beloved character was silenced forever by the man who should have been her greatest protector. The Land Before Time was released posthumously with a dedication to Judith's memory. Millions of children would grow up loving Ducky without knowing that the little dinosaur's voice belonged to a real little girl who died in unimaginable terror. The phrase, "Yep, yep, yep," became a cultural touchstone, but for those who knew Judith's story, it was also a heartbreaking reminder of what was lost. The tragedy of Judith Barsi sparked changes in how the entertainment industry handles signs of child abuse, but those changes came too late for her. She died believing there was no escape from her father's violence, when in reality, there were people who could have helped if they'd acted more aggressively on their suspicions. Judith's story stands as Hollywood's most horrific example of what can happen when the entertainment industry fails to protect its youngest performers. She wasn't destroyed by fame or drugs or exploitation in the traditional sense. She was murdered by domestic violence, while the adults around her watched and worried, but didn't act. Her voice lives on in the film she made, but the silence that followed her death speaks louder than any performance ever could. You're absolutely right. I repeated both Garland and Switzer. Let me replace those with Jackie Coogan and Gary Coleman to complete our list of 20 tragic child star stories. 2. Jackie Coogan, the kid who lost everything. Jackie Coogan was the first child star in film history, and his story became the template for every tragedy that followed. As the kid in Charlie Chaplin's 1921 masterpiece, 7-year-old Jackie didn't just steal scenes, he invented the very concept of child stardom. His performance was so natural, so heartbreaking, that audiences worldwide fell in love with this ragamuffin boy who could make them laugh and cry in the same scene. But Jackie's real-life story would prove far more tragic than any role he ever played. Born into a show business family, Jackie was performing almost before he could walk. His father, Jack Coogan Sr., was a vaudeville performer who recognized his son's extraordinary talent and charisma. When Chaplin discovered Jackie at a Los Angeles theater, it seemed like destiny. The partnership between the world's greatest comedian and the most naturally gifted child actor created cinematic magic that still moves audiences today. The kid made Jackie one of the most famous people on earth. At an age when most children were learning to read, Jackie was earning more money than bank presidents. His films generated millions in revenue, making him one of the highest-paid performers in Hollywood. Newspapers called him the richest kid in the world, and for a time, that seemed accurate. But Jackie's wealth existed only on paper, controlled entirely by his parents and their business managers. Under California law in the 1920s, parents had complete authority over their minor children's earnings. Jackie worked constantly, films, personal appearance tours, endorsement deals, generating enormous sums that he never saw. His parents spent lavishly, buying mansions, cars, and investments, while telling Jackie the money was being saved for his future. The work was grueling for a child. Jackie would spend 12-hour days on film sets, then travel for weeks at a time making personal appearances. He had no friends his own age, no normal school experience, no childhood beyond what the cameras captured. His education was handled by studio tutors, more concerned with keeping productions on schedule than ensuring he received proper schooling. When Jackie's father died in a car accident in 1935, the family's financial situation began to unravel. Jackie, now 21, discovered that the millions he'd earned as a child had vanished. His mother and stepfather had spent everything, leaving him with virtually nothing, despite a career that had generated unprecedented wealth for a young performer. Jackie sued his own mother and stepfather, seeking to recover some portion of his earnings. The case, which became known as the Jackie Coogan Law, exposed the systematic exploitation of child performers throughout Hollywood. Testimony revealed that Jackie's parents had spent his money on real estate investments that benefited them, luxury items for themselves, and high-risk ventures that lost fortunes. The legal battle destroyed what remained of Jackie's family relationships. His mother testified that Jackie had been compensated with room, board, and clothing, essentially arguing that supporting their child was payment enough for his labor. The callousness of reducing Jackie's extraordinary contributions to basic parental obligations shocked even Depression-era audiences accustomed to hardship. Jackie won the lawsuit but recovered only a fraction of what he'd earned. By then, his film career was essentially over. The cherubic child who'd charmed the world had grown into an ordinary-looking young man with limited acting training and no other marketable skills. He'd been working since age 4, but had never learned how to function as an adult in the real world. His later years were marked by financial struggles and failed attempts at comeback. He served honorably in World War II, then tried television, nightclub performances, and business ventures. Nothing recaptured the magic of his childhood success. The millions he'd earned were gone forever, but the psychological damage of being exploited by his own parents lasted a lifetime. Jackie's case led to California's Child Actors Bill, known as the Coogan Act, which required employers to set aside a portion of child performers' earnings in trust funds. But the law came too late for Jackie himself, who'd already lost everything that should have been his by right. He died in 1984 at age 69, having lived most of his life in the shadow of his childhood fame. At his funeral, film historians spoke about the boy who'd created the template for child stardom and paid the ultimate price for being first. Every child star who came after him owed something to Jackie Coogan, both the opportunities he'd created and the cautionary tale he'd become. The tragedy of Jackie Coogan isn't just that he lost his money, it's that he lost his childhood, his family relationships, and his faith in the adults who should have protected him. He spent his entire life trying to recapture something that had been stolen from him before he was old enough to understand its value. The kid who'd made the world laugh died, knowing that the people closest to him had cared more about money than about his welfare. 1. Gary Coleman, Diff'rent Strokes' biggest tragedy. Gary Coleman should have been living proof that the entertainment industry had learned from its past mistakes. Born in 1968, decades after the tragedies that had claimed earlier child stars, Gary had the benefit of stronger legal protections and greater awareness of the dangers facing young performers. But his story became perhaps the most heartbreaking of all, proving that fame can destroy children in new and devastating ways that no law can prevent. Gary's path to stardom began with a medical condition that would define his entire life. Born with a congenital kidney disease, he underwent multiple surgeries and treatments that stunted his growth and required lifelong medical management. The same condition that made his life difficult also made him perfect for television. At age 10, he looked like he was 6, with the face of an angel and the comedic timing of a seasoned professional. Diff'rent Strokes made Gary one of the most recognizable faces in America. His catchphrase, "What you talking about, Willis?" became part of the cultural lexicon. He was earning $100,000 per episode at the height of the show's popularity, making him one of the highest-paid child actors in television history. For 8 seasons, Gary was America's sweetheart, the tiny boy with the big personality who could deliver punchlines like a veteran comedian. But the money that should have secured Gary's future was disappearing as fast as he earned it. His parents had hired business managers who made investments that consistently lost money. Medical expenses from his ongoing kidney problems consumed enormous amounts. Legal fees from various disputes ate away at what remained. By the time Gary reached adulthood, most of his childhood earnings were gone. The end of Diff'rent Strokes in 1986 marked the beginning of Gary's adult nightmare. At 18, he looked like a child but was no longer cute enough for children's roles. His medical condition had left him just 4 feet 8 inches tall, making romantic leads impossible and limiting him to character parts that rarely materialized. The entertainment industry that had made him rich as a child had no use for him as an adult. Gary's attempts at comeback were increasingly desperate and degrading. He appeared on reality shows, did celebrity boxing matches, and took roles in low-budget films that exploited his Diff'rent Strokes fame rather than showcasing any actual talent. Each appearance reminded audiences of what he'd been rather than who he was trying to become. The medical expenses never stopped. Gary's kidney disease required constant treatment, including dialysis and eventually transplant surgery. The costs were enormous, and his dwindling finances couldn't keep up. He was forced to declare bankruptcy multiple times, each filing making headlines that focused on his financial troubles rather than his medical struggles. His relationships were complicated by his fame and physical limitations. Gary's size and appearance made normal romantic relationships difficult, and his trust had been shattered by family members and business partners who'd exploited him. He married twice, both relationships ending in acrimonious divorces that left him more isolated and financially depleted. The cruelest irony was that Gary remained famous enough to be constantly recognized, but not successful enough to capitalize on that recognition. People would approach him on the street expecting him to be the cheerful child they remembered from television, not understanding that Arnold Jackson had been a character, not a person. Gary felt trapped in a role he'd outgrown decades earlier. His later years were marked by increasingly erratic behavior and legal troubles. Arrests for disorderly conduct, assault charges, and public disputes with former wives and business partners painted a picture of a man at war with the world and himself. Each incident made headlines, turning Gary's private struggles into public entertainment once again. The end came suddenly on May 28, 2010. Gary suffered an intracranial hemorrhage at his Utah home and died 2 days later at age 42. Even his death became controversial, with disputes over his medical care and estate exposing the family dynamics that had shaped his troubled life. The boy who'd brought joy to millions died largely alone, estranged from family members who'd profited from his talent. At his funeral, former co-stars spoke about a man who'd been trapped by his own success, unable to escape the shadow of a character he'd created as a child. Todd Bridges, his Diff'rent Strokes brother, delivered a eulogy that was part tribute, part indictment of an industry that consumes its young. Gary never got to be a regular person, he said. He was Arnold Jackson until the day he died. The tragedy of Gary Coleman is that he lived long enough to see every promise of child stardom revealed as a lie. The money was gone, the fame had become a burden, and the joy he'd brought to others had never translated into happiness for himself. He died believing he was a failure, when in reality, he was a victim of circumstances beyond any child's ability to control. Gary's story stands as the ultimate indictment of child stardom in any era. Despite decades of supposed progress and legal protections, he was still exploited, still abandoned, still treated as a commodity rather than a human being. His death marked the end, not just of a life, but of any illusion that Hollywood had truly learned from its past mistakes. The boy who'd asked, "What you talking about, Willis?" spent his adult life asking a more painful question: what happened to my life? The answer, tragically, was that it had been stolen from him one episode at a time, $1 at a time, one lost opportunity at a time. Gary Coleman died as he'd lived since childhood, performing for others while dying inside, making people laugh while his own heart was breaking. These 20 stories represent more than individual tragedies. They're evidence of a system that was fundamentally broken, designed to exploit the most vulnerable people in the entertainment industry. The golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden for everyone. For too many children, it was a nightmare disguised as a dream. The saddest part isn't just that these young people died or suffered, it's that their pain was preventable. Every one of these tragedies could have been avoided with better protections, more oversight, and adults who put children's welfare ahead of profit. But the entertainment industry chose profit every time, leaving a trail of broken lives in its wake. Today we like to think things have changed, that we've learned from these tragedies. But every time a young performer struggles with addiction, every time a child star's parents squander their earnings, every time an adult takes advantage of a vulnerable teenager, we're reminded that the capacity for these horrors still exists. These 20 souls deserve to be remembered not just for their performances, but for their courage in facing unimaginable hardships. They entertained millions while fighting battles that would have broken grown adults. Their stories serve as both memorial and warning, a reminder that behind every child, star's smile is a real person, deserving of protection, respect, and love. The next time you watch those classic films and television shows, remember the real cost of the magic they created. Remember Jackie Coogan creating the very concept of child stardom, while losing everything he earned. Remember Gary Coleman making millions laugh while his own life fell apart. Remember all of them, and honor their memory by demanding better for the young performers who follow in their footsteps. Hollywood's golden age may be over, but its lessons remain painfully relevant. The price of fame should never be a childhood, and the cost of entertainment should never be a human life. These 20 young stars paid that price, so perhaps others won't have to. Their stories end in tragedy, but their legacy can be hope. Hope that we've finally learned to protect the children who dare to dream of stardom. In the end, they were all just kids who wanted to make people happy. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but the happiness they gave others came at the ultimate cost, their own. That's Hollywood's greatest shame and our collective responsibility to remember.